What's something your parents believe that you don't?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Only a small fraction of people ever learn that respect inside a family has less to do with love and more to do with leverage. Yesterday, something happened to me that I still cannot fully wrap my head around. My sister stood up during a family toast and called me a failure. She said it with a straight face, as though it were some long-accepted fact, and then she added that I should let her run my business because I had clearly never been able to handle it. What stung the most was not her words, because I have heard worse from her before, but my father nodding along in agreement, saying business is a young person's game and that I should stop pretending. No one defended me, not even my mother, who just sat there with that uneasy look she always wears when things turn ugly, but she wants to avoid picking sides. I wish I could say I spoke up, that I defended myself, that I called them out for their hypocrisy and cruelty. I did not. I simply stood, set my glass down without a sound, and walked out of the room. I could feel the silence following me, not because they regretted what they said, but because they probably thought I was proving their point, too weak to fight back. The truth is, I did not leave because I was weak. I left because I had already decided what the next move would be, and it did not involve wasting another second trying to win the approval of people who never intended to give it. On the drive home, I called Maya, my closest friend, and said only 2 words, "It's time." She did not ask what I meant. She knew. For months, I had been quietly collecting documents, notes, and records, everything tied to the way my sister runs her company. The irony is that her business never would have existed without me. I introduced her to her first suppliers. I gave her the outline for the logistics system she still uses. I even let her piggyback on my LLC back when she could not qualify for her own line of credit. Every time I offered help, she turned it into a weapon, twisting it to prove she was smarter, stronger, more successful. And every time my father saw her flashy launches and loud social media posts, he acted like she was the visionary and I was the tag-along. The truth, though, is that her company is built on shaky ground. Suppliers tolerate her because she brings in orders, but they complain about her late payments and last-minute demands. Her lease is month to month, and the landlord has told me more than once that he would prefer a tenant who paid on time and treated the property like a long-term home. Even her trademarks and product photography templates, the things she brags about as her creative genius, technically trace back to documents and registrations still under my holding company. For years, I told myself I would not use those details, that it was not worth the drama. Last night proved that holding back had bought me nothing but disrespect. As I sat in my car, I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder I had labeled Vanessa Contingencies. Inside were emails, drafts, notes, contracts, every piece of proof I needed that I had leverage if I ever chose to use it. I clicked on the first document, an introduction letter to Daniel and Priya, 2 investors I had been meeting with casually under the pretense of learning about asset deals. The truth is, they had been waiting for me to give the signal. I hit send. It felt less like revenge and more like a reset button I should have pressed long ago. By the time I got home, Daniel had already replied. He confirmed what we had mapped out during our what-if conversations. If Vanessa tripped certain covenants in her financing agreements, her debt could be bought at a discount, and whoever held that debt would control the terms. It sounded complicated the first time I heard it, but really it comes down to this. Banks and creditors care less about pride and more about paper. If you can prove someone is in breach or close to it, you get to call the shots. And Vanessa, with her constant overspending and obsession with appearances, was always skating too close to the edge. I did not feel triumphant. I felt calm, almost detached. I thought about my father, raising his glass and nodding at my sister's dig, and realized that nothing I ever said would change his opinion. He respected noise, not proof. He respected whoever looked like a winner in the room, not the one quietly keeping things afloat. So I stopped caring about changing his mind. Instead, I decided I would let the results speak. Before I went to bed, I sent one more message, this one to her landlord. It was short, polite, and completely professional. I let him know that if the current tenant ever defaulted or failed to renew, I would be interested in assuming the lease under my company. No threats, no drama, just information. He replied within 15 minutes saying he appreciated the note and would keep it on file. That was enough for me. As I closed my laptop, I realized something important. For years, I had been telling myself I wanted peace, that I wanted to avoid turning family into enemies. But what do you call people who humiliate you in public and laugh when you leave the room? Maybe they already made that choice for me. And if that was the case, then the only thing left was to protect myself, my work, and my future. I lay down, knowing that while they were still sitting around the table, finishing dessert and probably making more jokes at my expense, a chain reaction had already begun. Documents were in motion, calls were scheduled, and the people who understood leverage better than my family ever could were already positioning themselves. By morning, nothing would be the same. When I finally drifted off to sleep, I had one thought running through my mind, steady and unshakable. They wanted me to play the role of failure forever, but I had already moved into a role they would not even see coming until it was too late. By the time the sun would have been up if I had been looking for it, which I was not because I was focused on what could be moved with a few calls and a stack of well-kept receipts. I had already drafted the messages to the two suppliers who mattered most to my sister's calendar of launches, the ones I had introduced her to back when she was still borrowing my templates and asking me how net terms worked. And I kept the tone steady and respectful as I reminded them that reliability is not a mood but a habit, that I had always wired funds when promised, that I did not overpromise quantities to impress an audience I could not serve, and that if they ever felt exposed by late payments on the other account, I would be willing to place prepaid orders that covered a full quarter in exchange for a narrow exclusivity on the core items that kept her marketing machine spinning. I do not pretend I did this with a light heart, because saying you feel nothing when you pull a lever like that is a lie people tell to make themselves sound cold and untouchable. Yet what I felt most was not triumph or spite, but a clean click in my head where respect for myself finally aligned with a plan that protected my work and the people who depend on me, and when the first supplier replied to say that, while they could not breach any current commitments, a conditional letter could be prepared that would activate if the other account slipped past due by even a day, I thanked them without drama, forwarded the draft to Daniel and Priya, and explained in plain language why that one paragraph mattered more than any speech I could have delivered at a family table. Maya called to ask if I had eaten, which made me laugh because she knows that when I cross a line from thinking to acting I forget about everything that is not the next step, and she asked me whether I was sure this was not too much. Whether I would wake up in a week wishing I had taken a softer path, and I told her something I had not said out loud before, that I had already tried softness for years, and it had turned me into a convenient background character in a story that used my labor and erased my name, so perhaps clarity would hurt in the short term, but at least it would be honest and final. I spent the next hour writing a careful note to the photographer who built the brand library for my sister using my old shot lists and layout frames, because I wanted a clean record that the license terms attached to those templates were never transferred or paid for. And I did not accuse or threaten, I simply asked him to confirm whether any license fees had been remitted to my holding company for the derivative use of those templates across her catalog, and when he answered that no fees had ever been paid and that he had assumed the work fell under the early shared arrangement from years ago, I replied with a thank you and passed the confirmation to counsel with a request for a narrowly tailored reservation of rights that would do nothing more than put the world on notice that unauthorized use would be enforced, which is a quiet move that tells everyone to stop pretending paperwork does not matter. If you have ever dealt with landlords who have watched a tenant treat a space like a stage set rather than a business home, you know how quickly they respond to an operator who speaks in timelines and maintenance schedules instead of slogans. And when the building owner wrote back to say he had reviewed my financials and would welcome a conversation if the current situation became unstable, I saved the message, breathed once, and felt the ground tilt slightly in my favor, not because I had threatened anyone, but because people who own real things prefer dealing with someone who understands the cost of a broken dock door or a pallet that arrives wet. Daniel and Priya kept the tempo without pushing me faster than I wanted, which is why I trust them, and on our call they explained again, slowly and in human language, That when a borrower signs a financing agreement with cash balance covenants and reporting obligations, those promises become the rails that carry the train, and if the train jumps the rail, the person who owns the track decides where it stops. So the supplier letter and the landlord's openness did not just make my sister's position weaker, they made the debt cheaper to buy because risk has a price and investors respect math more than posturing. I know some people listening will feel a twist of disapproval in their stomach, and I do not blame them, because there is something unsettling about using paper and timing to shift power inside a family. Yet what I want to say clearly is that I did not invent these levers. I simply refused to keep pretending they did not exist while being publicly labeled a failure by people who had built their confidence on top of my uncredited labor. And if the choice is between another year of swallowing that, or a week of decisive actions that set boundaries forever, I can live with the latter. By late afternoon, the second supplier sent a short letter that mirrored the first, a conditional commitment that would route 2 high-margin SKUs to me if the other account missed payment or attempted to renegotiate terms without collateral. And when I looked at the dates on my sister's promotional calendar and compared them to the standard lead times these suppliers require, I understood that even a brief interruption would ripple straight through her launch claims and reveal how thin the runway really was, something her followers never see because they only notice the final photo and the caption that glosses over the frantic last mile. With those letters in the file, I asked my attorney to transmit the trademark and trade dress reservation in a tone that any adult would recognize as a firm boundary rather than a chest-beating threat. And while that document could sit quietly in a folder for months without being used, everyone who knows how branding works understands that the mere existence of an enforceable right changes negotiation posture overnight. Because a scramble to rename and relabel during a supply crunch is not a stunt anyone wants to pull while customers are watching. Maya texted to ask whether I felt even a little guilty yet, and I told her I felt steady, which is not the same as happy, because this is not the kind of thing you celebrate. It is the kind of thing you execute and then you sit with your choices and accept what follows. And while we were still on the phone, my screen lit with an unexpected notification from a regional bank I did not even know my sister used. A terse message requesting updated cash balances and short-term obligations by a date that was uncomfortably close, which told me more in 2 lines than any of her boasts had told me in 2 years, and when I forwarded it to Daniel and Priya, they did not send confetti or congratulations. They just replied with the sentence that changes everything in deals like this, that the clock had started. When the email from that regional bank landed in my inbox, I understood immediately that the timeline we had been cautiously preparing was no longer hypothetical. Because the request for updated cash balances and upcoming obligations meant that my sister's financing covenant was already wobbling, and the bank was trying to decide whether to treat her as a routine account or as a risk that needed to be offloaded quickly. I sat at my kitchen table with the laptop open and thought about how ironic it was that a public toast in front of relatives had been the spark, yet the real battle was unfolding in documents, clauses, and numbers that most of them would never bother to read or even understand. I forwarded the message to Daniel and Priya, and within an hour they replied that this was the exact opportunity we had been waiting for, because when a bank suspects a borrower may dip below the minimum cash balance required in their revolving credit line, they are often eager to sell the exposure at a discount to an investor who knows how to manage distressed obligations. I knew the terms sounded dry and detached, but what they meant in plain language was that if my sister so much as fell a few thousand short of her covenant, the creditor had the right to pull back. And whoever owned that debt could then enforce conditions or restructure the entire arrangement, essentially becoming the one who called the shots. For years, Vanessa had strutted like she was untouchable, telling the family that my numbers never added up, mocking me for being too cautious and too boring, while she flashed new product launches, rented bigger photo studios, and bragged about revenue without mentioning the growing line of credit that propped it all up. Yet in that moment, all her posturing felt paper thin, because when it comes to obligations, no amount of charm or spin saves you from a covenant you are about to break. That evening, Daniel explained to me in slow, deliberate terms that they would begin negotiations with the bank immediately, and that once the debt was purchased, the authority to demand cures or initiate remedies would be in our hands, not hers. He told me not to expect fireworks right away, because banks prefer discretion, but he promised me that once the ink dried, the relationship between my sister and her creditors would be permanently altered. I listened carefully, absorbing the reality that control in business does not always look like a stage with cameras or applause. Sometimes it looks like a PDF sitting in your inbox confirming that rights have transferred and you now hold the pen. Meanwhile, the landlord who owned her warehouse property responded again, this time saying that if the current tenant defaulted, he would be prepared to assign the lease to my company immediately, provided we accepted a modest rent increase and committed to a multi-year term. I did not hesitate to say yes, because I knew that warehouses are like arteries for these kinds of businesses, and when one artery is cut, the entire system weakens. The landlord had no loyalty to Vanessa. His loyalty was to rent checks that cleared, and after watching her delay payments, argue about maintenance, and demand last-minute changes, he was ready for someone who treated the space like an investment rather than a prop. I had my attorney draft a carefully measured letter to Vanessa's company, not dramatic or cruel, simply factual. She was required to cure the covenant issue or provide full transparency about her balances by a specific date. The tone was almost boring in its formality, which is exactly how I wanted it, because real leverage does not scream. It just sets deadlines and then waits to see who cracks first. As I signed the final draft, I felt a strange calmness wash over me. It was not joy, nor was it guilt. It was simply the recognition that a game she had played on appearances was about to be judged on substance, and substance is where she had always been weakest. Maya asked me over coffee whether I felt like this was revenge or justice, and I admitted that the line between the two is blurred. Because I would be lying if I said I did not enjoy the thought of my father hearing about his golden child scrambling to explain herself to investors, yet the larger truth was that I no longer cared about winning their approval. I cared about never again being positioned as the family failure while carrying more competence than the ones who mocked me. I told her that if you spend years being used as a silent foundation, you eventually either collapse or reinforce yourself with steel, and I had chosen steel. Later that night, while scrolling through social media, I saw my sister's newest post, a glossy photo of her standing beside stacked boxes of what she called the largest product run yet. At first glance, it was nothing more than her usual bragging, but then my eyes locked onto the details she had not considered: timestamps in the metadata, shipment numbers on the cartons, quantities that could only have been produced if she had placed the order weeks earlier without having the funds secured. To most people, it was just another post. To me, it was confirmation that she had spent money she did not have, relying on the assumption that momentum would cover the gaps. It was the exact mistake the bank had hinted at in their cautious email, and now I had visual proof. I leaned back in my chair, let out a slow breath, and realized that this single post, meant to boost her image, had just armed me with the final piece of leverage I needed to show Daniel and Priya that the debt purchase was not only justified but urgent. My sister had always believed that noise equaled power, but in business, noise without capital is just a countdown to collapse, and whether she admitted it or not, that countdown had already started ticking. As I closed my laptop, I whispered to myself the same phrase I had said the night of the toast when I left the table without a word: let the results speak. And now, with contracts moving and deadlines set, those results would soon be undeniable, whether my father wanted to face them or not. When the cure letter went out through my attorney, drafted in that careful and deliberately colorless tone that tells the other side they are being treated with the same formality as any other client, and not as a sibling in a family feud, I knew there was no way to retreat from what had begun, because once a deadline is set in writing and copied to counsel, the entire rhythm of events is dictated not by feelings, but by dates on a calendar and signatures on documents. I spent the next several days in that strange state where every phone buzz might mean a new development, and while I tried to continue working on my own company's operations, the reality is that I could not stop watching the slow unraveling of Vanessa's carefully staged image. The first cracks appeared with the suppliers who, as soon as her payment slipped by a single day, immediately pulled the trigger on the conditional exclusivity letters I had arranged, shifting core product availability to my account and freezing her pending shipments until further notice. From the outside, it may have looked like a minor hiccup, the sort of thing a brand might explain away with vague talk about unexpected delays, but from the inside it was the equivalent of cutting power to a building before a live performance, because no matter how loud the music was supposed to play, the speakers were silent. Customers started posting questions on her social media feeds, asking when their orders would ship, why tracking numbers were not updating, and whether refunds would be issued. And I could imagine her frantically messaging her staff to come up with answers that would buy time, even though no answer could cover the simple truth that inventory was being held back for lack of payment. I did not cheer when I saw the questions pile up. I felt that same mix of steadiness and inevitability I had carried since the night of the toast, because what was happening was not a stunt or a cheap trick. It was the consequence of years of neglecting the boring, unglamorous side of running a business. It was in the middle of that week that my phone lit up with her name. I let it ring the first time, and then the second, before finally answering on the third attempt, because part of me wanted to hear what version of Vanessa would come through the line. The smooth-talking charmer who convinced people to work overtime without pay, or the brittle voice that emerged whenever the mask slipped. As it turned out, she cycled through both in the span of a 10-minute call, starting with honeyed words about how we were sisters and should not let outsiders dictate the terms of our relationship, before quickly snapping into accusations that I was sabotaging her, that I was jealous, that I was hiding behind legal maneuvers instead of competing fairly. I said very little, just enough to make clear that I had no interest in rehashing childhood fights, and when she finally hung up with a bitter laugh, I saved the call log and made a brief note for myself, pattern repeating, document everything. Not long after, my father left a voicemail that still plays in my mind, not because it surprised me, but because it captured exactly why I had stopped looking for his approval. He said, in that tone he always uses when he believes he is the reasonable patriarch keeping the family together, that family comes first, that I needed to be a team player, and that whatever paper games I was running should be set aside for the sake of unity. He did not once ask how I felt about being called a failure at his table, did not acknowledge the hours of unpaid labor I had poured into helping his other daughter build her image, did not even pretend to weigh the fairness of the situation. His concern was appearances, not justice. I saved that message too, not because I planned to use it in any legal way, but because it reminded me that every time I doubted myself, every time I wondered if I had gone too far, I could replay his words and remember exactly why I had chosen this path. Meanwhile, Daniel and Priya executed the next step of our plan with a precision that left me both grateful and slightly in awe, acquiring a second, smaller note tied directly to her equipment financing, which meant that piece by piece, her obligations were shifting out of her control and into the hands of people who valued stability over drama. By this point, the math was simple. Either she settled on our terms or she faced restructuring that would end with her assets sold off to cover debts. I could have left it there, letting the pressure collapse her business outright, but I made a different choice, one that even Maya questioned at first, because instead of pressing for liquidation, I drafted an offer that would allow Vanessa to exit with dignity. The offer included protection for her employees, a plan to pay vendors in an orderly fashion, and even a severance package that would let her walk away without total humiliation. I wrote it not because I felt merciful, but because I wanted it clear that I was not driven by cruelty. I was driven by the need for closure and boundaries, and if she chose to reject a fair path, then the consequences would be hers alone. When I sent the one-page proposal to her attorney, I knew the response before it arrived, but I needed the record. Hours later, her reply came, not through counsel, but as a direct text to me, reading only, over my dead body. I stared at those words for a long time, realizing that, even as her walls collapsed, she clung to pride as if it were a lifeline, and in that moment I stopped expecting any form of reconciliation or recognition. I forwarded the message to Daniel and Priya and wrote 3 words beneath it: proceed as planned. As night fell, I thought about the questions piling up online, the suppliers who had already shifted their loyalty, the landlord preparing to sign over the lease, and the stack of obligations that were now in investors' hands instead of hers. I thought about my father's voicemail, my sister's defiance, my mother's silence. And then I thought about the moment, not far away now, when the people who had laughed at me over dessert would wake to discover that while they were busy with toasts and insults, I had been building a framework of quiet, relentless moves that would change who held the keys. And for the first time in years, I felt not small, not invisible, but steady in the knowledge that their opinions no longer had the power to define me. The final stage unfolded with a speed that almost felt unreal, because while months of quiet preparation had gone into creating the framework, the actual collapse and transfer of control happened in a matter of hours, leaving me standing in the middle of a situation that felt both inevitable and astonishing. Once Daniel and Priya confirmed that the debt purchases had closed and that the stack of obligations my sister had been balancing was now effectively in their hands, everything else moved like falling dominoes. The bank that had once treated her with caution now deferred to the new note holders. The landlord who had been hesitant suddenly had a signed assignment of the lease ready for my review. And the suppliers who had already shifted allegiance treated me as the primary operator. Each move was procedural, written in dull legal language, but the combined effect was seismic. The empire Vanessa had performed so confidently from behind glossy posts and stage launches was no longer hers to command, and the authority she believed was built on charm and noise had been replaced by contracts, signatures, and enforcement. When dawn broke that morning, I did not feel triumphant in the way movies teach you to expect, with fireworks or tears of joy, but instead I felt a strange, grounded calm. The kind that comes when you finally understand that you are no longer trying to win an argument, but simply living inside a reality you built with steady hands. I drafted a brief message to my father, not angry, not pleading, just final. I wrote that I would never again try to earn his respect through words or explanations, that from this point forward results would be the only language between us, and that if he ever wanted to know who had been the real foundation of the family's so-called success stories, he could look at the documents now filed with creditors, suppliers, and the landlord. I hit send without expecting a reply, and none came. Later that morning, I drove to the warehouse where most of her staff had been anxiously waiting for direction, and when I walked inside, there was no need for speeches about destiny or revenge, because the papers in my bag spoke louder than any declaration. Vanessa arrived not long after, her expression shifting between fury and disbelief, and for the first time, she realized she was not the one holding court. I told her plainly that I was not there to gloat, that I had no interest in humiliating her further, and that she had two paths ahead. The first option was to remain involved as a well-paid operator under the new ownership structure, with oversight, accountability, and restrictions that would ensure the company no longer ran on whims. The second option was to walk away with a severance package, a clean non-disparagement clause, and the chance to rebuild something else if she could stomach the humility. She scoffed, called me a fraud, accused me of betrayal, but when I slid the executed documents across the table, showing that Daniel and Priya now controlled the debt stack, that the landlord had already signed the lease assignment, and that suppliers had locked into my exclusivity agreements, the fight drained from her voice even if her pride refused to admit defeat. I will not pretend it was easy to look her in the eye as she realized her stage had been dismantled, because part of me still wanted to remember her as a sister rather than a rival. Yet another part of me knew this was the only way to end a cycle that had consumed years of my life. I made clear that I was not keeping her brand for myself, because ownership was never the point, leverage was. Daniel and Priya would manage the restructuring, repay the obligations in an orderly fashion, and ensure employees and vendors were protected. My role was not to wear her crown, but to prove that I would never again bow to the role of failure she and my father had scripted for me. When she stormed out of the room, slamming the door as if volume could restore authority, I sat quietly on a folding chair and let the silence settle. I thought about how many times I had been told I was too cautious, too boring, too invisible, and I realized those very traits, My insistence on keeping records, honoring contracts, and respecting details were the weapons that had won this war without me ever raising my voice. There was no need to rub victory in her face, because the truth was already undeniable. By morning, the empire she had mocked me from had become the property of the very investors she once laughed off as irrelevant, and I was the one who had orchestrated it. As I left the warehouse, Maya called and asked me the question she had been waiting to ask all along. Would I ever tell my father the entire plan, every detail of how I had taken back control piece by piece, or would I simply let the outcome speak for itself? I told her honestly that I had not decided, because part of me wanted to send him every document and make him read each line until he finally saw me as more than the background character. But another part of me believed that silence would sting him more deeply than any explanation ever could. After all, he had taught me through his indifference that results were the only proof he respected. So perhaps the most fitting answer was to live by his own lesson and let him wonder how the daughter he dismissed had turned out to be the only one who understood how power really worked. That evening, as the reality settled in that the business was no longer hers, I poured myself a simple glass of water, sat by the window, and felt no need for grand declarations or celebrations. What mattered was not revenge for its own sake, but the fact that I had ended a story in which I had been cast as the failure. Now I was the one who had chosen clarity over humiliation, leverage over noise, and boundaries over endless arguments. The story was not about destroying her. It was about refusing to let myself be destroyed by their dismissals any longer. And in that quiet, I understood that true power does not come from loud toasts or public praise. It comes from the calm certainty that you will never again be underestimated, because the results already speak.